Hello, everyone. Good evening. A very warm welcome to everyone, all the audience, and our honorable speaker, Mrs. Renuka Kumar. Let me begin by introducing her. Renuka Kumar is a second year PhD student at the University of Michigan, advised by Dr. Atul Prakash and Dr. Roya Ensafi. Her research interest spans different facets of mobile software and system security and mobile measurement studies. The webinar is hosted by IEEE Signal Processing Society Delhi chapter, along with IEEE GTBIT Women in Engineering Affinity group. So, hello and welcome, ma'am.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Sachin. Let me just first thank the IEEE SP Delhi chapter and the host student organization, which is GTBIT, Women in Engineering Affinity Group, for having me over to share my work with you. So I'll first give you an overview of my talk, and then maybe at the end of it, open the floor for questions. That's how it works, right, Sachin?
Right.
Yeah, okay. So
Yours.
all right, sounds good. Okay, so my research, my talk is on the security analysis of Unified Payments Interface, which is also called as UPI, which is released in India in the year 2016. This research is a collaboration with my advisor, Professor Prakash, and my colleagues, Srish and Haulu. So I'll get on with the talk first. We all know that India was predominantly a cash-based economy, and early Indian apps were digital wallet apps. While they existed, they were not that popular and was not the common mode of payment. So digital wallet apps, how they functioned, for two users wanting to do a transaction, the users would have to install the exact same payment application like Paytm and would have to add money to the wallet, and the payment service provider would do a wallet-to-wallet transaction. Now, this was a story until 2016. In 2016, the National Payments Corporation of India, or NPCI, launched UPI to facilitate free and instant micropayments from a mobile platform. And the backend infrastructure they released is called UPI. UPI is nothing but a shared backend infrastructure that facilitated bank-to-bank transactions. Now, for two users wanting to do a transaction can now install any one of the UPI-enabled apps from Google Play Store and simply add their bank account to it to carry out a bank-to-bank transaction. Now, UPI has found tremendous amount of success, and as of June 2020, there are 155 banks live on UPI and has carried out 1.3 billion transactions worth 34 billion US dollars. Now, in this research, we conduct a security analysis of the multi-factor authentication workflow of UPI 1.0, which is a complex black box application layer protocol that's used by several Indian payment apps today. Now, a quick context into what has happened on the research on Indian payment apps. There has actually not been much research. The earliest research on Indian payment apps was done, I think, somewhere around 2010. And it was done on a payment service called ECO, which is launched by SBI. The researchers showed that it is possible to compromise the PIN used by ECO in just under 7 transactions with a very high probability close to 1. In a later research, in a much larger scale research, which was done in 2015 by Reeves et al., it was a very popular paper at that time, they extensively studied all the payment applications that was available worldwide. And there were about 46 payment applications, if I remember right at that time. And they specifically studied 3 popular apps from India. And they found that these apps all have core SSL vulnerabilities. They made use of weak crypto keys. They facilitated clear text storage and transmission of data. And also they allowed information exposure through logs. Note that this research was all done pre-UPI era. To distinguish prior research from our research, so our research is not on the payment apps themselves. our research is on the underlying UPI infrastructure that is shared by these payment applications. And to the best of our knowledge, we conduct the first exhaustive study on this unpublished black box application layer protocol. And we uncovered core design weaknesses in its workflow. We show attacks that can exploit these weaknesses, and we further show how to scale these attacks. We also studied different versions of UPI apps over time, and also the transition of UPI from UPI 1.0 to 2.0. Our work has led to significant real-world impact, and NPCI has addressed our disclosures to change the workflow of UPI to make it more secure than it previously was. And we also obtained several CVEs along the way. This work recently appeared at Ustic Security in August 2020. A quick outline of my talk. I'll first gloss over the details of how we reverse engineered UPI, and then we'll examine the UPI 1.2 protocol handshake in detail from an attacker's perspective. And I'll show you a demo of an attack and a few key takeaways from this research, and then open up for questions. When we started this research, we did not know anything about UPI. Protocol itself, not the high-level guidelines, the protocol itself. So I said that UPI was a black box application layer protocol. And what I meant by saying that was that the protocol specifications itself is unpublished. But that said, UPI does provide certain broad guidelines for users wanting to integrate with UPI or use UPI. Now, for a user to use UPI, his primary cell number must be registered with the bank out of band. There's 3 steps to be able to use a UPI app. In the first step, the user has to first set up a user profile and then add a bank account to it. I think most of you must have already seen this. Now, while adding the user profile, the UPI app sends the user's cell number to the UPI server for verification, at which point the UPI server issues a UPI ID to the user. The user then has to select from a list of banks that UPI provides to add the bank account, and then subsequently set up a UPI PIN to authorize transactions. UPI stipulates 3 factors for authentication. The first 2 factors are used for user profile setup. The first factor is called as a device fingerprint, which is nothing but a binding between the cell number and a user's device information. And this binding at the server side is called as device hard binding. The second factor is the passcode, which according to specification is optional, but I think most apps do have it. And the third factor is the UPI PIN. And to set up a UPI PIN, a user has to provide 6 digits of the debit card number and the expiration date. Now, since nothing was known about UPI to us, our first objective was to uncover the details of the client-server handshake between the UPI app and the UPI server step by step, and we collect from each step what were the credentials required at that step and what were the where any user-specific attributes leaked in each step. And we also look for alternate workflows that could be used by an attacker to compromise the UPI handshake. Finally, we triage our findings to determine any plausible attack vectors. Now, there are 2 significant reverse engineering barriers that we had to overcome. First is that the protocol itself was unpublished, and we had no backend access to UPI servers. So to understand the UPI protocol and to extract its detailed handshake, we analyze UPI through the lens of the many UPI apps that's available on Google Play Store. But that said, unlike what prior research has shown, where the UPI app, where Indian payment apps had significant vulnerabilities, what we found is that this new generation of Indian payment apps are significantly more secure. They are actually designed with security in mind, and each of these apps have a different set of security defenses built into them. So these apps are overall significantly well thought out. For instance, these apps were all obfuscated. They used encrypted communication. They could detect the presence of an emulator. They required a physical SIM card to be present on the phone, which essentially made dynamic analysis very difficult. And most of all these apps were thoroughly reviewed by NPCI before being allowed into the market. So they had a security review process for these apps. So the approach we took is a combination of static reverse engineering, code instrumentation, and traffic analysis, depending on the app that we used. Now, for the first part of this research, we made use of Beam app. Beam, I'm pretty sure most of you have used it. So Beam was India's flagship app and a reference implementation of a UPI app. So to study the UPI client-server handshake, what we did was that we instrumented Beam apps, the GUI of the application, so that we could map the GUI that generated a particular traffic. So we first studied Beam app and we confirmed our findings on other popular UPI 1.0 apps. We studied the Android flavors of these apps because Android was the most popular operating system in India. A quick outline of what I'm going to talk about next. I'll first go through the UPI handshake and then give you a demo of an actual attack. So I described the attack from an attacker. I described the handshake from an attacker's standpoint. The goal of an attacker here is to compromise an existing user's Beam account onto an attacker's phone. So what are the assumptions we make in this research? A quick overview of the threat model. We assume a good user that installs Beam from Google Play Store, and the user uses a properly configured phone and prevents unauthorized physical activity to the user's phone by untrusted parties. That said, we also assume a very good attacker that uses a rooted phone and can reverse engineer any of the UPI apps. The attacker also releases a useful but unprivileged Trojan app called Mali, which somehow makes its way to the user's device, to the victim's device. So essentially, Mali is an attacker in the user's device. Mali is designed with two permissions. The first permission is internet permission, which is a normal permission and is granted by default by the Android system. The second permission is receive SMS permission, which is actually a dangerous permission and requires user consent. But that said, more than 15% of applications today, including some of the most popular social media applications and security applications, actually use SMS permissions. So we think that the Mali is rather unprivileged. For the attack to succeed, we assume that Mali is already installed on the victim's device. The victim's device has already been compromised. Now the question is this threat model realistic? Now, according to Google, threat because of potentially harmful applications are very real. And India is in the top 3 countries with the most number of PHAs pre-installed. Almost 53% of the attacks use PHAs on low-cost cell phones. So now let's look at how the user profile part of the workflow can be compromised first, which involves compromising the device binding as well as a passcode. I'll first go through the workflow of UPI from a general standpoint, and then describe how this workflow can be compromised by an attacker. Now, in the first step, the UPI app on the user's client device grabs the user's device details and sends it to the UPI server. The UPI server saves the device information and then sends a registration token back to the client. So under the hood, how does this look like? On the left is the client application and on the right is the UPI server. The client sends a user's device ID, OS version, manufacturer, and model to the UPI server, and the UPI server sends a token back to the client. In step 2 of the protocol, the application Beam app on the user's device automatically reads a user's cell phone from the device and sends an SMS containing the registration token to the UPI server. Under the hood, Beam application allows a user to choose the user's SIM card, and based on the user's choice, it sends an SMS containing the registration token to the UPI server, and the UPI server sends an SMS delivery confirmation back to the client. Now, finally, the UPI server verifies a user's cell number and then confirms to the client that the binding has in fact succeeded. So under the hood, the client sends an HTTPS GET request to verify the binding, essentially showing encrypted communication. And the UPI server confirms that the binding has actually succeeded and also sets a flag that indicates whether the user is a new user or an existing user of UPI. Now the flag here is set to false, indicating a new user of UPI. That's the default workflow. Now, from an attacker's standpoint, the step 2 of the protocol is rather more secure than a traditional OTP-based verification, because for an attacker to compromise step 2 of the protocol, the attacker has to compromise the protections provided by the cell phone company. So initially, we were stumped at this point. We did not know how to compromise this step. We explored the workflow further, and we found that the makers of UPI has in fact put in an alternate workflow which used an OTP-based verification, which is already proven to be insecure. This workflow was triggered when the send SMS step of the protocol, the step 2 of the protocol, failed. And this failure can be induced by either putting the phone on airplane mode or leaving insufficient SMS balance on the device itself. So when the step 2 of the protocol fails, now the user is prompted to key in a cell number, as you see on the left. The cell number, along with the registration token, is sent as an HTTPS message to the UPI server, and the UPI server at this point sends an OTP back to the client. So how does the whole thing look like from an attacker standpoint? An attacker that is trying to register with the UPI server, the attacker's device details is sent to the UPI server. The UPI server sends registration token back to the attacker. Attacker induces a failure in step 2 of the protocol by putting it in, say, airplane mode, at which point the attacker is prompted to enter the victim's cell number, and the attacker enters the victim's cell number, at which point the cell number along with the registration token is sent as a message to the UPI server via HTTP. The UPI server now sends an OTP back to the victim. Okay. Now, for the attack to succeed, for the binding to be compromised, the attacker requires the OTP, for which the attacker uses the attacker-controlled app or MALI. MALI, with its receive SMS permission, can intercept the OTP and subsequently forward the OTP to the attacker, at which point the attacker now can enter the OTP and compromise the binding. So what this shows is that to break device binding, all the attacker requires is a user's cell number and one OTP from that number. That said, for a new user or a non-user of UPI app, this binding essentially compromises pretty much the user profile setup, since for the setup to be compromised entirely, all the attacker requires is a passcode which the attacker can enter on the user's behalf. So for a new user, how does this look like? The attacker's device details is sent, the device binding is successful, at which point the attacker is prompted to enter the passcode. The attacker can simply enter an attacker-controlled passcode on behalf of the victim, at which point the UPI server prompts the attacker to add a bank account. What is imperative to note here is that the passcode is a secret that the user shares with the payment server and not the bank. Okay, what this essentially means is that for third-party payment apps like Google Pay or Paytm, the passcode is a secret that's shared with the Paytm server or the Google Pay server and not with the bank. So for an attacker to compromise the passcode, attacker can always use an attacker-controlled account. So once the attacker enters the passcode or sets the passcode, the attacker is now prompted to enter the bank account of his choice. So the UPI provides a list of bank accounts. And what we found at that time is that we could simply brute force through the list of banks, and the UPI server did not appear to prevent brute force attacks. And the attacker can simply start with the most popular banks like SBI or ICICI or HDFC. Once the attacker makes the right choice of bank, the UPI server then returns the user's bank account number, name, and the entire information, bank account details, back to the client. What you can see until now is that the attacker at no point in the workflow is ever prompted for a bank-specific secret to be provided about the user. So the attacker can simply go through the entire registration process without having to provide any secrets related to the user. How does this differ for an existing user? So for an existing user, the attacker has to compromise the passcode. So how does an attacker compromise the user's passcode? There are a few ways to do this, and the paper describes more information about that. In a quick one way we tried to do this was to use a overlay screen that exploited a known vulnerability. And at the time of entering the passcode, the Mali on the user's device draws an overlay on Beam's login screen and simply intercepts the passcode. Now, the intercepted passcode is forwarded to the attacker, and the attacker can now enter the passcode, and the UPS server will finally provide the bank account number and name. The overlay screen that we tried did not require any additional permissions on behalf of Mali, so it was rather trivial. Let's now take a quick look at an attack. A few preconditions for the attack to happen. We assume that the victim's device is already compromised with Mali. The attacker on attacker's device installs a repackaged version of Beam with all of Beam's client-side defenses disabled. Now, we assume that the attacker knows the user's cell number, but that said, in India, cell number is not a secret, and we also have talked about in the paper how a cell number can be learned. So it's rather trivial, and in India, sharing cell numbers is also pretty common. So for the attack to happen, we assume that the victim's device is compromised with Mali, and the attacker knows the user's cell number. A quick video on this. On the left is the attacker device. On the right is the victim's device. The victim already has a Beam account set up, and the Mali is running on the victim's device in the background. The user enters a passcode, and Mali intercepts the passcode. Just to show you the bank account of the user. The user has an ICICI account ending in 2101. And what you see here in the background on the victim's device is Mali running in the background, the Trojan app in the background. On the left is the attacker device. The attacker is setting up Beam for the very first time, a repackaged version of Beam. The attacker is prompted to choose his SIM card. Attacker chooses his SIM card, at which point the registration token is sent to the UPI server. In this case, we induce a failure in the send SMS step of the protocol. And when the failure happens, it's still sending SMS. It will be done in 5 seconds, I think. There you go. Okay, so the send SMS fails, at which point the attacker is prompted to key in the victim's cell number. I'm masking the cell number further for privacy. The cell number that's entered along with the registration token is sent to the UPI server, at which point the UPI server sends an OTP to the victim's device. So you should see an OTP incoming on the right. That's the OTP. Mali intercepts the OTP, and the previously intercepted password and the OTP is actually forwarded to the victim, to the attacker, sorry, which you see on the left. That's the SMS containing the OTP and the passcode. The attacker now enters the passcode. And at this point, you can see the victim's account synced onto the attacker's device, account number ending in 2101. So what the attack shows is that an attacker can sync an existing user's bank account. And like I said before, at no point during the workflow was the attacker ever prompted for a bank-specific secret about the user. That essentially allowed automating the entire attack. At this point, while the user profile setup has been compromised, for an attacker to actually carry out a transaction, the attacker actually requires a UPI PIN. What we found at that time is that the UPI PIN can be leaked the exact same way as a passcode. But that said, setting a UPI PIN only requires partial debit card information and no secrets that's shared with the bank. In contrast, using a debit card or doing a debit card transaction in India requires a complete card number and a PIN number which is shared with the bank. So essentially, setting a UPI PIN is a lower bar in India. But that said, in India, it's pretty common to actually hand out debit cards also. So it's not difficult to actually get the printed information on the card. So we did this on Beam first. We did this on different versions of Beam first. And then we also did try the attacks and confirm the workflow with other UPI apps, third-party UPI apps available at that time, popular apps at that time, like Samsung Pay, PhonePe, and Ola. And the only distinction between Beam and the other UPI apps, third-party apps, is that the UPI interface is accessible only after passcode-based authentication, which we could use, which we could do using an attacker-controlled account. Passcode was easily bypassable. So what are the consequences? Unlike mobile wallets where the money is only lost from the wallet, in case of a UPI app compromise, an attacker can potentially empty out your bank account. Now, has this been exploited yet? Now, there are a few cases which we have seen that has used a similar workflow compromise, but in those cases, we've seen that the attackers have actually resorted to social engineering attacks more commonly, and not the automated attacks that we have described. But that said, there are instances of compromise that follow a typical model, a similar model. We confirmed all our, we disclosed all our vulnerabilities to CERTIN as well as NPCI in 2016, 2017, 2018. And we also filed for a bunch of CVEs, with CERT US. We found a lot of PII, personally identifiable information, leaks in payment apps, which also were disclosed to all the payment app vendors. And we also got a 5K bounty from Samsung for our disclosure. Now, in August 2018, NPCI released UPI 2.0, and what we found is that NPCI has closed the step 2 of the protocol, the weak device binding mechanism that was used for our attack. But that said, the other pitfalls remained. So in part 2 of our analysis, we actually did analyze Paytm and Google Pay and Amazon Pay. So we are currently still working on the analysis of UPI 2.0, but that said, we have not yet found any exploits for this. But just to give you an idea of what we saw from a packet capture on Paytm, Now, for the device binding mechanism, UPI 2.0 collects a lot more information like a user's location, IMEI number, SIM number, and this is possibly used to strengthen the binding. Now, we also saw that in UPI, we saw this in UPI 1.0, but in UPI 2.0 also we saw the exact behavior where in the add bank account phase, the UPI server returns a user's entire banking information back to the client. The details include bank account name, IFSC code, account number, account type, and a whole bunch of information is returned back to the client. Now, this is a little concerning in the sense that now third-party PSPs have access to your banking information, and a compromise of the third-party server can potentially leak all your information. And we have seen such Beam compromise happening. I think in June 2020, there was a report of a data breach where a whole bunch of user information was compromised. So this is still existing in UPI 2.0. That said, what else can you do with the bank account information? Beam, for instance, uses a bank account number to reset passcode. So an attacker who has access to a user's bank account information can potentially use it to reset a passcode. Now, to sum this up in total, there are about 155 UPI apps that share the common UPI backend infrastructure, and a vulnerability in any one of the applications is sufficient to compromise another application. So an attacker can potentially use any one of the 155 apps to leak the information. With regards to UPI 2.0, we did the disclosures to certain in December 2018, and we are still talking to NPCI. They reached out to us again in August 2020, and we did confirm, we did notify the concerns to them regarding the banking information in August. To wrap up the talk, a few key takeaways from this research. NPCI actually relies on security by obscurity, which has been proven to be ineffective. We are not sure about the assumptions that NPCI has made in its design of UPI, whether they rely on client-side assumptions or server-side assumptions, or a combination of both. As a result, when a compromise happens, or if a compromise were to happen, we are not able to assess the reasons or the scope of the compromise or the impact of the compromise. Now, the second key observation that we had during this research is that none of the payment application vendors or UPI has factored in systemic limitations, Android systemic limitations, or the issues that arise from a user's bad behavior, which we think is very crucial for while designing a payment protocol. Now, as a result, getting these app vendors or NPCI to do the bug fixes was non-trivial, because the blame often fell back on either the user or the Android system itself. And we think that both have to be factored in for a payment protocol. Now, NPCI provided a weak feature, an OTP-based workflow as a feature which could be compromised very easily. Now, while they have addressed this in UPI 2.0, the entire security of the protocol relies on the send SMS step of the device binding mechanism, which is not currently compromised, but which potentially could be, because security is a moving target. So in our future work, what we plan to explore is basically a way to compromise the send SMS part, maybe through SIM fraud, for instance. We also want to assess what are the implications of a compromise of a third-party PSP, like a Paytm server, because a vulnerability in one of those servers can actually compromise a whole bunch of user information. So all this said, what is imperative is an open vetting of the protocol to make it secure. That said, I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about today, and open the floor for questions.
All right. So it was a very wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Let us see if we have some questions. Anybody have they have any questions? They can put it on the chat window. Okay, until we get one, I do have a question. It was very well explained. Even when I don't have much knowledge about UPIs and all, I was able to understand certain things. So,
Okay.
having said that, I had a little query that I'm not sure if that happens in other countries too. But then, how to secure our cell phones? As you said, cell phone numbers. As you said, in India, it is very common to share or get someone's cell phone number. So, is it a way that we can secure it somehow, or is the only factor is to not share it?
I think securing a cell phone number is not possible. It's kind of hard because you end up giving it somewhere, right? It's like, can you secure your email ID? Kind of, it's I think it's not trivial to secure the cell phone, but I think you should not rely on the cell phone. I think prior research has already shown that, a protocol that's relying on a publicly available information cannot be guaranteed to be secure, right? So this is publicly, so I think essentially what is missing in UPI is that it relies on public information in most places. Like, cell phone is publicly known, debit card number printed on the card, a partial information printed on the card, which you can find a way to leak it in India, essentially. So I think they don't have any secrets in this step. So that is where I think, and they rely on UPI pin, and setting UPI pin is also weak. How to set it is also weak. So I think they should factor in a secret at some point in the workflow. I think relying on cell
All
phones
right.
alone is not the way to go.
Okay. So we didn't have a question, but somebody does have some good wishes to give us. They're very happy for or getting it organized.
Sure,
So right. So thank you so much, ma'am. Once again, I don't think the audience has more questions on this,
sure.
but even if they do have, I think they can contact you somehow on emails or
Absolutely.
somewhere.
Absolutely. I think my
Okay.
website has my email, so they can always reach out.
Sure, certainly. So thank you so much once again for taking out
Thank you,
time and
Sachin.
giving us your
Sure.
presentation.
Thank you for having me also.
IEEE SPS DC as well as IEEE GTBIT is honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Bye.